The weight of the case rested on Emily's fragile shoulders. She was the sole witness to an attempted abduction, a case that could put a dangerous man behind bars for life. But there was one problem. Emily hadn't spoken a single word since the attack. Across the courtroom, Richard Hale sat at the defense table, his expression composed, almost smug. A 45-year-old software engineer with an unassuming appearance, Hale had been arrested after an eyewitness placed him at the scene of Emily's abduction attempt. But his defense was strong. No physical evidence, no confession, and a witness who couldn't testify. His lawyer had built a strategy around discrediting the traumatized child's ability to identify him. Then, something happened. As Emily settled into the witness chair, her green eyes met Hale's. Her small fingers trembled, making a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, one she had learned in therapy. Only two beings in the room noticed it, Judge Sullivan and Rex. Rex's reaction was immediate. The moment Emily's fingers twitched in that silent plea for help, the dog's body went rigid. His ears pricked forward, muscles coiling like a loaded spring. A low, guttural growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound of warning, of recognition. His golden brown eyes locked onto Hale, unwavering and piercing. A ripple of unease spread through the courtroom. Whispers filled the air. This wasn't just a well-trained support dog reacting to his handler's distress. This was something deeper, something primal. Judge Sullivan brought his gavel down hard, the sharp crack echoing through the room. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he announced, his voice unusually firm. Prosecutor Jenna Collins shot him a questioning look, but he didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he glanced at Emily, who clung to Rex like a lifeline. Something significant had just happened, and he needed to understand exactly what before the trial proceeded. As the courtroom emptied, Sullivan remained seated, his mind racing. In all his years on the bench, he had never seen a therapy dog react with such undeniable certainty. What had Rex recognized? And more importantly, what did it mean for the case? In the hallway, Emily knelt beside Rex, her tiny hands gripping his fur. Her mother, Sarah Carter, bent down beside her, smoothing back the child's curly hair with trembling fingers. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" she whispered. Emily didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her grip on Rex tightened as she pressed into his side. A few steps away, Jack Monroe, the lead investigator on the case, watched the scene unfold. A grizzled FBI agent with decades of experience, Monroe had long trusted his gut, and right now it was telling him that whatever had just happened in that courtroom was a game-changer. He stepped closer to Judge Sullivan. "Something spooked that dog," he murmured. "I'd bet my badge he recognizes Hale from somewhere." Sullivan exhaled slowly, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. "Then we need to find out where." Meanwhile, inside the defense's private room, Richard Hale sat across from his attorney, Michael Graves. The moment they were alone, his smug confidence twisted into something else, something colder. His fingers drummed against the table as he replayed the moment in his mind. The girl hadn't spoken, but the dog had. "The dog reacted," Hale muttered under his breath. Graves raised an eyebrow. "What?" Hale forced a small smile. "Nothing," he said, but his mind was already racing. That damn dog. He hadn't considered Rex a problem before, but now he realized the animal might be the key to unraveling everything. As the 15-minute recess neared its end, Judge Sullivan straightened his robes and took a deep breath. He didn't believe in coincidences, and something told him that Rex had just given them the most important clue of the trial. It was time to dig deeper. And for the first time since the case had started, he felt the tide shifting. Before the silence before the courtroom, before the terror that stole her voice, Emily Carter had been a chatterbox. At 5 years old, she was the kind of child who filled a room with endless stories, her bright blue eyes gleaming with curiosity and mischief. She loved fairy tales, stuffed animals, and the way her mother read bedtime stories in different voices for each character. She had never known fear, until that afternoon. It had been a perfect spring day. the kind where the scent of blooming flowers drifted through the air and the warm sun painted golden streaks across the backyard. From the kitchen window, Sarah Carter watched her daughter twirl in the grass, her pink dress flaring like a dancer's. A smile tugged at Sarah's lips. David Carter would be home in a few hours, and she debated whether to start dinner or wait for him. It should have been an ordinary afternoon. It should have been safe. At 3:42 p.m., Sarah's phone rang. Her sister was calling from out of state. She stepped inside for what she thought would be a quick conversation. 4 minutes. That was all it took. When she returned to the yard, the gate stood ajar. A wave of cold terror shot through her veins. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the yard. Emily was still there, but she wasn't alone. A black van idled near the curb, its side door slightly open. A man knelt beside Emily, his smile unnervingly warm. "I have puppies in my van," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. "Special ones. They need a little girl to take care of them. Would you like to see?" The world seemed to slow. Sarah's instincts screamed before her mind could process what was happening. "Emily!" The man's head snapped up. His smile vanished, replaced by something sharp and calculating. In an instant, he grabbed Emily's arm. Emily froze. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She only stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes, locked in place by some deep, primal fear. Across the street, Martha Jenkins, a retired nurse walking her terrier, saw everything. Her voice, weathered with age but strong with conviction, rang out, "Hey, get away from that child!" The man hesitated. His grip loosened for a fraction of a second. That was all it took. Emily yanked her arm free and bolted toward her mother. Sarah scooped her daughter into her arms just as the van's engine roared to life. Tires screamed against the pavement as the vehicle sped away, leaving black streaks of rubber on the road. Sarah clutched Emily tightly, her heart pounding against her ribs. But Emily didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only buried her face into her mother's shoulder and trembled. The investigation, the police arrived within minutes. Detective Jack Monroe, a seasoned FBI investigator from the Child Abduction Task Force, took immediate control of the scene. His graying hair and sharp brown eyes spoke of years spent chasing shadows, searching for missing children who were often never found. He had seen this pattern before, too many times. "He fits the profile," Monroe muttered, flipping through a worn notebook. 4 children have disappeared in the last 18 months, all approached near their homes, all lured by promises of puppies. His partner, Agent Lisa Grant, knelt beside Emily, her voice gentle but firm. "Sweetheart, do you remember what the—" The man looked like silence. Sarah brushed Emily's hair back, her hands trembling. "Honey, it's okay. You're safe now. Can you tell the nice officer what he looked like?" Emily's small hands gripped her mother's sweater tightly. But she didn't speak. She didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, shutting her voice off completely. "She hasn't said a word since I picked her up," Sarah whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "She just won't talk." Agent Grant exchanged a look with Monroe. "Selective mutism," she murmured. "A trauma response." Monroe sighed, rubbing his temple. "Without a statement, we don't have much. The description is vague. A man, a black van. That could be anyone." Martha Jenkins, the retired nurse who had witnessed the abduction attempt, stepped forward. "I got part of the license plate," she said firmly. "The first 3 letters. YKZ." Monroe's gaze snapped to her. "That's something." Sarah, still clutching Emily, felt a surge of helplessness. Her daughter, once so full of life, had retreated into herself, and in the days that followed, it only got worse. Emily stopped playing. She stopped drawing. She refused to leave the house, flinching at the sight of passing cars. She barely slept, and when she did, her nights were filled with silent nightmares. Her small body thrashing against invisible threats. Her screams never came. Only gasps of terror that woke her parents in the dead of night. Sarah and David tried everything. Story time. Favorite foods, her beloved stuffed bunny. Nothing worked. The child they knew was slipping further and further away. One evening, Sarah sat across from David at the kitchen table, her eyes hollow from exhaustion. The therapist recommended a support animal, she said quietly. A therapy dog. David ran a tired hand through his hair. You really think that'll help? I don't know, Sarah admitted, but I'm willing to try anything. Neither of them could have known how much that decision would change. Everything, because while Emily had lost her voice, there was someone who could still hear her, and his name was Rex. The air inside Dr. Laura Bennett's Animal Rehabilitation Center was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the earthy musk of fur. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of a clock and the occasional scratch of claws against the tiled floor. On a large orthopedic bed near the window, a German shepherd lay still, his deep brown eyes tracking every movement with quiet intensity. His name was Rex. Once, he had been one of the finest canine officers in the city's police force, a dog whose instincts and training had saved lives. But now, he bore the scars of sacrifice. One particularly jagged mark ran down his right flank, a permanent reminder of the night that ended his career. 3 years ago, during a raid to rescue a kidnapped child, Rex had lunged at an armed suspect, without hesitation. The man had slashed at him with a knife meant for an officer, cutting deep into his flesh. Rex had subdued the suspect, even as blood darkened his fur, but in the months that followed, the injury never fully healed. His mobility was affected, and the department, strapped for funds, made the difficult decision to retire him. He had been placed on a euthanasia list, deemed unfit for service. That was before Laura stepped in. Dr. Bennett had been running the therapy animal program for years, specializing in cases where animals could help trauma survivors. When she heard about Rex's case, she fought to adopt him, convinced that his sharp mind and unwavering loyalty still had value. And now, she was about to test that belief. Sarah, Carter sat nervously in a chair, her fingers gripping the fabric of her skirt. Emily stood behind her, peeking out from behind her mother's shoulder. The little girl had refused to speak since the incident 2 weeks ago, and though she had attended therapy, nothing had coaxed a word from her. Laura knelt to Emily's level, her voice gentle. Hi, Emily. My name is Laura, she said softly, kneeling to Emily's level. I work with very special dogs that help kids who've been through scary things. Emily didn't respond. Her green eyes flickered toward the large German shepherd, a few feet away. Rex sat patiently, his ears perked forward, but he didn't move. He simply watched, his presence steady, unthreatening. Would you like to meet him? Laura asked gently. Emily said nothing, but she didn't run. That was a start. Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair. He's a very nice dog, sweetheart. He used to be a police dog, just like the ones in your storybooks. Laura gave Rex a quiet command. Stay. The German shepherd didn't so much. As twitched, Laura turned back to Emily. You don't have to come close if you don't want to. Rex will wait right here. But if you feel ready, you can put out your hand, and he'll come to you. For a long moment, Emily remained frozen in place. Then, inch by inch, she stepped out from behind her mother. Her tiny hand lifted, hesitant but deliberate. Rex remained still, waiting for the final cue. When Laura gave a small nod, the dog slowly lowered his head and took a careful step forward. Then another, and another. The moment his warm breath brushed against Emily's palm, something shifted. Her fingers curled slightly, brushing through the dog's thick fur. A connection was made. Sarah gasped softly, pressing a hand to her mouth. It was the first time Emily had reached out, to anything or anyone, since the attack. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Oh, baby." Emily's small fingers burrowed deeper into Rex's fur, gripping him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had turned terrifyingly uncertain. Laura smiled. That's a good girl, Emily. Rex likes you. The child didn't speak, but she didn't let go. a silent bond over. The next few weeks, Rex and Emily became inseparable. At home, she would sit beside him for hours, her tiny hands tracing the scar along his side. When nightmares woke her in the middle of the night, it was Rex's steady heartbeat that calmed her. Though she still refused to speak, she began drawing again. Simple crayon pictures of a girl and a dog, standing together against shadowy figures. One afternoon, while sitting on the floor of Laura's office, Emily watched Rex perform a simple trick, and then something remarkable happened. "Good boy," she whispered. The words were so soft that for a moment Sarah thought she had imagined them, but when she turned, she saw Emily staring at Rex, her lips slightly parted in wonder, as if she too had surprised herself. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Laura placed a gentle hand on Sarah's arm. "She trusts him," she murmured. "Sometimes trust is the first step toward finding your voice again." Sarah squeezed her hand. "Then we'll follow wherever that trust leads." And it would lead them somewhere they never expected, to a courtroom where a monster would finally be unmasked. The trial. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. The gallery was packed. Journalists, families, and legal observers all watching as one of the most high-profile trials in recent memory was about to begin. At the center of it all, the defendant, Richard Hale, sat beside his attorney. His expression was unreadable. Despite the weight of the charges against him, he appeared disturbingly calm. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the polished wood of the defense table. Seated beside her mother, Emily Carter clutched Rex's leash tightly, her small fingers wrapped around the thick fabric as if it were a lifeline. The German shepherd sat alert beside her, his ears pricked forward, his deep brown eyes locked onto Hale. Every so often his nose twitched, as if he was scenting something familiar in the air. "All rise," the bailiff's voice rang through the chamber. Judge Mark Sullivan entered, his robe flowing behind him. He took his seat at the elevated bench, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Then, briefly, his gaze settled on Emily and Rex, and the trial began. Judge Sullivan had already ruled in favor of allowing the therapy dog's presence, but he knew the decision was far from universally accepted. "Before we proceed with opening statements," he said, his deep voice steady and controlled, "the court will hear arguments regarding the presence of the support animal during these proceedings." Michael Graves, the defense attorney, rose smoothly from his seat, adjusting his tie with practiced ease. "Your Honor," he began, his tone polite but firm, "while we understand the prosecution's argument for emotional support, the presence of this animal is highly prejudicial. A large German shepherd in the courtroom may evoke an emotional response from the jury, one that could unfairly bias them against my client. We respectfully request that the dog be removed during testimony." "Jenna." Collins, the lead prosecutor, was on her feet before he had even finished. "Your Honor, Emily Carter is 5 years old. She is a trauma survivor who has been diagnosed with selective mutism as a result of her experience. Rex is not here as a spectacle. He is a medically necessary support animal. His presence allows Emily to participate in these proceedings without undue distress." Judge Sullivan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I have already reviewed the documentation submitted by the child psychologist and the animal behaviorist," he said, his tone final. "The dog remains." A murmur spread through the courtroom, some in agreement, others grumbling under their breath. Graves pressed his lips together, clearly displeased but unwilling to argue further. He returned to his seat, casting a glance at his client. Richard Hale remained eerily still, his expression unreadable. The trial begins. The prosecution wasted no time painting a chilling picture of Hale's actions, a pattern of manipulation, deception, and predatory behavior spanning years. Witnesses took the stand, each testimony adding weight to the charges against him. Martha Jenkins, the elderly neighbor who had witnessed the abduction attempt, recalled the terrifying moment she saw Hale trying to lure Emily into his van. Her voice trembled as she described the way he had grabbed the child's arm before fleeing when confronted. Emily sat through it all in silence. Her small frame was nearly swallowed by the large wooden chair. Occasionally, her fingers flexed around the leash in her lap, but she never let go. Whenever the tension became too much, she would glance down at Rex. The German shepherd remained perfectly still, his quiet presence grounding her. Then it was time for her testimony. A hush fell over the courtroom as Emily was gently led to the witness stand. Sarah Carter walked beside her, her protective gaze never wavering. She helped her daughter into the seat before stepping away, though every muscle in her body remained taut with the instinct to scoop Emily into her arms and take her far from this place. Jenna Collins approached carefully, her demeanor soft and
warm. "Hi, Emily," she said with a gentle smile. "I know this is a little scary, but remember, you don't have to say anything you don't want to. You can just nod or shake your head if that feels easier. And if you ever need a break, just let
us know, okay?" Emily didn't look at her. Her gaze remained fixed on the table, her breathing shallow. Then, as if sensing her unease, Rex pressed his body lightly against her leg. She reached down, gripping a handful of his fur. Slowly, she nodded. Jenna's smile remained steady. "Good," she said gently. "Emily, can you tell us who was with you in your yard that day?" For a long moment, the little girl hesitated. She didn't lift her head. But then, slowly, deliberately, she raised her arm and pointed directly at Richard Hale. A ripple of tension passed through the room. Hale's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, a brief, involuntary tightening of his jaw. Graves immediately stood. "Objection. The child has been repeatedly shown images of my client prior to trial. This identification is unreliable." Judge Sullivan held up a hand. "Overruled. The jury will determine the credibility of the witness." Jenna turned back to Emily. "Emily, did this man say anything to you that day?" The child didn't speak. Instead, she made a small movement with her hand. A subtle sign, the same one she had made that day. The day she lost her voice, and in that moment everyone in the courtroom understood. Emily made the same small movement, the one she had given before. Rex understood instantly. The German shepherd's ears snapped forward, his muscles tensed, and a deep, guttural growl rumbled from his chest. It wasn't aggressive. It was a warning. Shockwave rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Sullivan sat forward, his brow furrowed. Graves was on his feet again, this time with more urgency. "Your Honor, I object. This is pure theatrics." But Sullivan wasn't listening. He was watching Rex. The dog had gone utterly still, his entire focus locked onto Richard Hale, as if recognizing a scent only he could perceive. It was the same reaction he'd had when Emily first saw Hale, the same instant instinctual response. A thought struck Sullivan. He turned to Jenna. "Miss Collins," he said, his voice carefully measured, "has this animal had any prior interaction with the defendant?" Jenna hesitated. "Not to my knowledge, Your Honor." Sullivan turned to the defense table. "Mr. Hale, have you encountered this dog before?" For the first time, Richard Hale showed real emotion. His fingers, which had been tapping so calmly earlier, clenched into a fist. His jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Jenna's eyes widened. A realization clicked into place. She turned to her co-counsel and whispered something quickly. A second later, a member of the prosecution team rushed out of the courtroom. Graves scowled. "What is going on?" he demanded, his patience thinning. Jenna straightened, her expression unreadable. "Your Honor, I request a short recess. There may be new evidence relevant to this case." Judge Sullivan studied her for a long moment before giving a single nod. 15-minute recess. As the courtroom emptied, whispers filled the air. Speculation spread like wildfire. Had Rex just recognized Richard Hale? And if so, from where? Something told Judge Sullivan that the answer to that question would change everything. A lead that could break the case. The weight of the case bore down on the prosecution. Richard Hale had now been officially linked to multiple disappearances. Yet without Emily's full testimony, the trial teetered on the edge of uncertainty. But no one expected that the key to unraveling the case wouldn't come from the child. It would come from the German shepherd who never left her side. The morning. Air was crisp as Jenna Collins led the prosecution team into the courtroom. "Your Honor," she addressed Judge Sullivan, her voice measured but urgent. "The prosecution moves to introduce new forensic evidence. Soil samples found in Richard Hale's van have been analyzed, and the results point to a specific location, a remote, unoccupied cabin in the northern woods. Detective Jack Monroe, a veteran investigator who had worked on similar cases for decades, stiffened at the mention of the site. He knew what this could mean. "We request a 24-hour recess to follow." Up on this lead, Jenna continued. "We believe this evidence may provide the final piece needed to close this case." Michael Graves was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a delay tactic. My client has already endured extensive questioning, and there is no solid evidence tying him to this so-called cabin. Soil samples are circumstantial at best." Judge Sullivan's stern gaze silenced him. "Motion granted," he ruled. "The prosecution has 24 hours. Court is adjourned." As the judge's gavel struck, Monroe and his team mobilized, and Rex, Emily's ever-watchful protector, was coming with them. His reaction to Hale had been unmistakable. Perhaps he could sense something that human eyes had missed. The cabin. By early afternoon, the search team arrived at the desolate cabin. The place was eerily silent, the surrounding trees whispering with the wind. A thick layer of dust covered the porch, yet faint footprints leading toward the back door suggested recent activity. Rex was the first to react. As soon as they neared the structure, his ears perked. His nose twitched with keen intensity. Then, his body stiffened, his tail raised, muscles tensed like a coiled spring. A low, warning growl rumbled from his chest. Pacing anxiously at the threshold, his entire posture screamed one thing: "This place is wrong. The truth beneath the floorboards." "Rex knows something's here," Monroe murmured, gripping his flashlight tighter. The team moved cautiously, weapons drawn. Inside, the cabin was sparse. Just a table, a cot, and a corner stacked with empty food cans. But something felt off. Monroe's sharp eyes caught it first, a faint, unnatural seam in the wooden floor near the back wall. He knelt, running his fingers along the slight indentation. He knocked. Hollow. "There's something under here," he said. With swift precision, the officers pried the boards loose. What they found made the blood drain from their faces. A hidden staircase spiraled downward into a dark, narrow basement. The air grew thick, damp, and suffocating as they descended. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, revealing a chilling sight: children's belongings, scattered toys, tiny shoes, a faded pink backpack, and in the farthest corner, chained but still alive, was a girl, Emma Sullivan. The 8-year-old had been missing for 6 months. Her face was pale, her clothes ragged, but the moment she saw the officers, her wide, tear-filled eyes held something stronger than fear: recognition, relief. "Help," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Rex reacted instantly. The German shepherd strained against his leash, whining, his entire body vibrating with urgency, as if he could feel the suffering this child had endured. Monroe rushed forward, fumbling with the lock before scooping Emma into his arms. "You're safe now," he assured her. "We've got you." She clung to him, her frail body trembling. The search had finally come to an end, but the nightmare wasn't over yet. The final strike back at the courthouse, news of Emma's rescue spread like wildfire. The gallery was packed, the air crackling, with anticipation as Jenna Collins prepared for the final strike against Richard Hale. The judge allowed Emma's discovery into evidence, along with the soil samples linking the cabin to Hale's vehicle. Jenna stood, her expression cold and unyielding as she turned to the defendant. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice sharp as steel, "how do you explain the presence of an abducted child locked in a basement on a property tied directly to you?" For the first time, Richard Hale looked shaken, his usual composure cracked. His fingers twitched. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered. Jenna pressed forward, her tone unwavering. Your DNA was found on the chains. Your vehicle's tires match the tracks outside the cabin. And most importantly, Emma Sullivan is alive. She let the weight of that settle, which means she can testify against you. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. A single survivor, a single witness. Enough to dismantle his entire defense. Hale's jaw tightened. His lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but the color had drained from his face. Then, it happened again. Rex, lying at Emily's feet, suddenly lifted his head. His ears flicked. His hackles rose, a deep, vibrating growl rumbled through his chest. The room froze. The German shepherd took slow, deliberate steps forward, his gaze locked onto Hale, a look of recognition. Hale flinched. Everyone saw it. The man who had been so arrogant throughout the trial was visibly sweating, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He turned to his attorney, muttering frantically. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I want to change my plea. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. Judge Sullivan's gaze darkened. Mr. Hale, are you stating that you wish to plead guilty? The room held its collective breath. Hale exhaled shakily. Yes, justice and healing, the abrupt end of the trial, sent shockwaves through the nation. Richard Hale was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A predator finally caged. Yet the true heroes of the case weren't just the lawyers or detectives. It was a 5-year-old girl who found her courage, and a dog who never gave up on her. Days after the sentencing, Emily spoke her first words in weeks. Holding Rex's face in her small hands, she whispered, Thank you. Her parents wept, knowing their daughter was finally finding her way back to them. And as Rex wagged his tail, nuzzling her gently, it was clear. Some bonds are unbreakable. No matter how dark the world becomes, there will always be those willing to stand against the darkness, even if they walk on 4 legs.